Everything began with silence. Not the kind that fills an empty house, but the kind that feels arranged, heavy, deliberate, almost designed. Inside a vast mansion in Highland Park, Dallas, morning light slipped through tall glass windows, gliding across polished oak floors before halting on a wall of cold, gleaming marble. The grandfather clock ticked steadily. Each sound marks the heartbeat of a test about to begin. And right at the center of the room stood an open safe. Its steel door glinted with an icy, metallic sheen. Inside were neat stacks of crisp US dollars, layered like bricks. Among them were a Rolex, solid gold jewelry, and a few diamonds that caught the chandelier's light. It looked accidental, but in truth it was a perfect trap. Hidden in the shadowed doorway, Ethan Caldwell, 55, a once famed oil magnate across Texas, watched the open safe with a cold, precise stare. His face was still as a lake at dawn, but in his eyes burned something that wasn't anger. It was instinctive distrust. He'd spent a lifetime being betrayed. A business partner who embezzled millions, a best friend who drained his company and vanished, a wife who left, taking half his fortune and whatever faith he had left in humanity. Since then, Ethan had learned how to live surrounded by wealth and yet trust no one. He'd once said bitterly, "Money doesn't corrupt people. It just reveals who they really are." And today, he intended to prove that once more. Before leaving the room, Ethan had turned off every hallway camera. No guards, no witnesses. Just him. And one woman he meant to test. Maria Alvarez, the new housemaid. She'd been working here for barely 2 months, polite, quiet, never prying into her employer's affairs. Always early, always meticulous, always leaving without a word of complaint. Too perfect, too proper to be real. Ethan glanced at his wristwatch. 8:40 a.m. 2 more minutes. Then Maria would walk into the study, as she did every Wednesday morning. He leaned forward slightly, holding his breath. There was no emotion left in his eyes except expectation. Maria Alvarez, the quiet woman from El Paso. Her name was Maria Alvarez, 35 years old, a woman who walked softly, whose eyes were gentle, and whose smile never fully appeared. No one knew what she had lived through. They only knew that every morning she was the first to arrive at the Caldwell mansion, and the last to leave. Maria was born in El Paso, that borderland between Texas and Mexico, where the sun burned gold across rows of small houses, and the desert wind carried the scent of dust blended with the aroma of fresh corn tortillas in the morning. She once had a simple, ordinary life. A husband who worked as a mechanic, 2 little daughters, and a mother who loved growing wildflowers on the porch. But everything changed within a single year. A highway accident took her husband. Her mother's cancer treatments drained every cent she had. Insurance barely covered anything. Debt piled high. And Maria, a woman who once only knew sewing and cooking, packed her entire life into one small suitcase, brought her mother and 2 children to Dallas, and began working as a part-time housekeeper. From that day on, she learned to live quietly. Never cry in public, never complain. Just bow her head and work, holding close the words her mother had once told her. "My daughter, don't let poverty take your dignity. People can steal everything from you, but no one can take your integrity, unless you give it away yourself." And Maria believed that as profoundly as she believed in breathing. In the eyes of everyone at Caldwell Mansion, Maria was just another quiet maid, invisible. She moved like a shadow. When she mopped, no sound. When she cleaned, no trace. When someone asked how she was, she simply smiled and said, "I'm fine, thank you." But inside her was an endless struggle, worrying about her mother's hospital bills, worrying about her daughter's tuition at the public school, worrying if she'd still have a job next month. And amid all those worries, she held on to the one thing no one could touch: the purity of her conscience. Ethan Caldwell, owner of the mansion, saw her every day, but to him, kindness was often just a mask for deceit. He had seen loyalty turn to betrayal. He had seen the wife who once vowed never to leave him walk away with his attorney and a six-figure check. When a man has been wounded by trust, every act of goodness looks like a lie. So that Wednesday morning, Ethan devised a new way to prove human nature. Yet again. He ordered all hallway cameras turned off, placed just enough money in the safe to tempt anyone, and left the door wide open minutes before Maria was scheduled to clean the room. No one knew, no one would see, only him, and in his mind a cold whisper echoed, "If she's truly honest, I'll know. If she's not, at least I'll be right again." But sometimes, what people truly seek isn't to prove they're right, but to be wrong and still forgiven. Ethan didn't know that the test he designed to expose a poor woman would instead expose the hollow loneliness within himself. 8:42 a.m. Texas sunlight poured through the tall glass windows, spilling across the oak floor in soft golden stripes, and stopping right where the safe stood open. The steel glinted, cold, unblinking, like an eye waiting for judgment. Maria gently pushed open the office door. The feather duster in her hand made a faint swish. The room was empty. No voices, no music, only a strange kind of stillness, the kind that makes one pause, sensing someone unseen. Then she saw it, the safe, wide open. For a heartbeat, her breath caught, her eyes widened, startled, uncertain. On the shelves, the money, neat stacks upon stacks, as if placed deliberately. Crisp $100 bills, smooth as glass, and flashes of gold glimmered under the chandelier light between them. She took one step forward, then stopped, looked around. No one. Turned toward the hallway. Empty. Only the ticking of the clock, tick-tock, tick-tock, like the echo of her own heartbeat inside her chest. She had cleaned this room dozens of times, but never once had she seen the safe open. Inside it lay enough wealth to change her life, to pay her mother's hospital bills, to buy back the small house in El Paso, to give her daughters a new beginning. The thought came swiftly, then it vanished just as fast, like a wisp of clouds burned away by the morning sun. Maria tightened her grip on the handle of the duster. She closed her eyes for 1 second, hearing her mother's voice echo in her mind. "My daughter, some doors open only to test your soul. Step through, and you may never find yourself again." One deep breath. She opened her eyes and moved closer to the safe. Her white gloves trembled, not from temptation, but from fear of leaving a smudge. Instead of touching the money, Maria took a small cloth from her apron pocket and bent down. Gently, she wiped the edge of the safe where a thin layer of dust had gathered, the kind most people never notice. Every motion was careful, slow, deliberate, as though she wasn't cleaning steel but clearing away invisible suspicion surrounding her. Planes, one of Ethan's favorites, hung. She stared at it quietly momentarily, as though speaking to someone unseen. And then, What she did next made Ethan, a man who had watched hundreds crumble before greed, take an involuntary step back into the shadows. Maria reached into her pocket, pulling out a small, wrinkled photograph. Its edges were worn, the paper soft. In it were two little girls standing beside a hospital bed where an older woman smiled faintly. The light was dim, but the happiness was unmistakable. It was her mother and her daughters, everything she had left in the world. Maria placed the photo gently on the shelf beside the stacks of cash. In the reflection of the chandelier, the two images, family and fortune, faced each other like two opposing worlds. She looked at them for a long moment, then whispered, her voice trembling in Spanish. Dios, mantén mi corazón limpio. Lord, keep my heart pure. She bent down, kissed the photograph, slipped it back into her pocket, and slowly closed the safe door, sealing away a temptation no one would ever know existed. Outside, Ethan stood frozen. He couldn't believe his eyes. She hadn't taken anything. She hadn't hesitated. She hadn't even looked around. She cleaned the dust, placed a memory, and whispered a prayer. He didn't know why his throat tightened, only that his eyes began to sting. In that silent mansion, the wealthiest man in Highland Park realized the one being tested was never the maid. It was him, and the heart he'd long since turned to stone. When the safe door closed with a sound so soft it seemed to dissolve into the air, Ethan remained standing in the shadows, like a man who had just witnessed something sacred, something his mind could not yet name. He kept watching through the small gap between the wooden doors. Morning light fell across Maria's hair as she folded her cleaning cloth, tucked it back into her apron pocket, and walked out with quiet composure, never looking back. There was no sign that she knew she had just passed a cruel and silent test. Ethan closed his eyes. A drop, sweat or tear he couldn't tell, slipped down his temple. All he knew was that his chest ached, as if he had just glimpsed something long vanished from this world. Honesty that asks for no witness. He stepped slowly out from his hiding place. The room remained still. The faint scent of polished wood lingered. The safe stood closed, quiet, like it had never been open. In the pale light, the image of Maria bending to kiss the photograph, of the two little girls and the ailing mother, replayed in his mind like an old film reel. That kiss was not for memory, but for faith. Faith that goodness was still worth choosing, even when no one was watching. Ethan sank into the leather chair behind his desk. His hands trembled, not from age, but from a strange sensation, the feeling of a wall collapsing somewhere inside him. He had once prided himself on his ability to read people, to see through lies. He'd believed that suspicion was the armor that kept him alive in a world built on money and deceit. But now, after watching a poor woman dust instead of steal, he realized, maybe I was never truly rich. I just owned too many things to hide how empty I'd become inside. He leaned back in his chair, eyes lifted toward the chandelier. Its crystals scattered light across the ceiling, each flicker stirring a memory. The friend who betrayed him, the wife who once promised forever but disappeared with his fortune, and himself. The man who chose solitude because he no longer dared to trust. In that vast mansion of steel gates, passwords, and cameras, he had built every form of protection imaginable. Except in Horizon, Ethan sat alone in his library, surrounded by shelves of books on success, strategy, and investment. and realized the one subject he most needed to study again was a character. He opened an old leather-bound notebook and wrote a single line, shaky but resolute. "Tomorrow, I will thank her." Then he closed the book, and in that quiet moment Ethan finally understood. The most significant test in life is not whether others can be trusted, but whether we ourselves still have the courage to believe in goodness one more time. That night, Dallas was wrapped in a strange kind of quiet. Outside, the wind whispered through rows of old oak trees carrying the scent of rain and earth. Inside the Caldwell mansion, every light was out, except for the faint glow of the fireplace, its wavering reflection playing across the pensive face of a man sitting motionless in the dark. Ethan Caldwell leaned back in the leather chair by the window, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand, eyes fixed on the pool outside, where ripples of water shimmered beneath dim backyard lights. He couldn't sleep. He didn't want to. The scene from that morning kept replaying in his mind, every detail sharp and vivid. The open safe, the sunlight, the gloved hands, the worn photograph, and that gentle kiss that felt like a prayer. Everything had happened in silence, and yet that very silence had shaken him more than any sermon ever could. Ethan tilted his head back and closed his eyes. How many years had it been since his heart last felt this unsettled? He had commanded hundreds of people, signed contracts worth millions without flinching. And yet, a single act by a poor woman had made him feel small. In his mind, he heard his late father's voice. "You can own the whole world, son, but if you lose faith in people, you own nothing." He used to think his father was naive. Faith, in Ethan's world, was a luxury, something to be used, traded, or betrayed. But tonight, he finally began to understand. Maybe it wasn't that people had stopped being good. Maybe he'd simply been too afraid of betrayal to see goodness anymore. He stood and walked toward his desk. The faint scent of cleaning solution still lingered in the air, the kind of clean that felt honest, not artificial. The white cloth Maria had used to wipe the safe was on the desk, folded neatly in the corner. Ethan reached out and touched it. The fabric was soft, cool, and for a brief moment he felt he was touching the essence of her dignity. "She could have taken everything," he whispered, "but instead, she left me something money could never buy." Finished. Ethan set the letter aside and sat in silence. The fire crackled softly, casting his shadow against the wall. A solitary, aging figure that somehow looked cleansed of the dust of cynicism that had long covered his soul. He didn't sleep that night. Not out of guilt, but because his heart was awake. By the time the first light of dawn slipped through the curtains, Ethan was still there, with the letter and a blank check lying side by side on the desk. He added one final line. "Integrity is priceless, but so is peace. You've given me both." Then he sealed both the letter and the check in a cream-colored envelope and placed it on the kitchen counter, the spot where Maria always brewed her morning coffee. No cameras, no witnesses. Just a quiet gesture left to be discovered, the same way she had quietly awakened his conscience. The next morning, Dallas glowed under a soft golden light. The sky was so clear it almost seemed to echo sparrows chirping outside the porch. Maria pushed open the kitchen door daily, carrying the scent of freshly ground coffee and the faint trace of morning dew still clinging to her jacket. She set her bag on the table, turned on the coffee machine, And in that quiet, ordinary moment, something unusual caught her eye. On the granite countertop, between two white porcelain cups, lay a cream-colored envelope, perfectly placed, with neat, deliberate handwriting across the front. For Maria. She lifted her head, glancing around. No one. Only morning sunlight poured through the window and the rhythmic water dripped inside the coffee maker. After a brief hesitation, Maria picked up the envelope. Inside was a sheet of heavy paper, written in bold blue ink, firm strokes, slightly slanted but steady. She read slowly, line by line. Her hands began to tremble when her eyes reached the familiar signature at the bottom. Ethan Caldwell. Maria, honesty doesn't make you rich, but it makes you free. You gave me something money could never buy. Peace. This isn't a reward. It's a thank you. Use it for your daughters, for your mother, for the life you deserve. E.C. Tucked beneath the letter was a blank check already signed, but with no amount written. Maria stared at it for a long time, then gently placed it back down as though afraid to stain it. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling onto the envelope, soaking into the fibers of the paper. She pressed a hand to her mouth, a quiet sob escaping. Not out of greed or shock, but she wasn't used to kindness finding its way back to her. Her heart pounded. Images flooded her mind all at once. Her mother in a hospital bed, the overdue bills, her two little girls laughing over breakfast of cold toast. And now, all those worries seemed to dissolve in a single breath, not because of money, but because someone had finally seen her. Because her decency, however small, had been recognized. Maria folded the letter, held it to her chest, closed her eyes, shared the same quiet thing. Faith. On the counter, the letter lay open, its blue ink trembling slightly in the breeze from the air vent, the last line catching the sunlight. Integrity is priceless, but so is peace. Maria took a deep breath, wiped her eyes dry, opened the cabinet and pulled out 2 cups. She poured the coffee and gently slid one toward Ethan. No words, just a simple gesture. But in that silence, both of them knew that something deep within them had changed forever. 3 days later, Dallas had softened after the season's first rain. The air so clear, it felt as if the whole city had been washed clean. A black SUV rolled to a slow stop before a modest little house in Garland, where low porches bloomed with purple bougainvillea. Ethan Caldwell stepped out, dressed simply in a collared shirt with no driver or bodyguards, carrying only a paper bag and a thick folder. He paused at the wooden fence, listening to children laughing behind the window. That laughter, pure, unguarded, softened something in him. It had been long since he'd heard joy untouched by motive. Maria appeared at the doorway, surprised to see her former employer standing outside her home. She wiped her hands on her apron, flustered. "Mr. Caldwell, what are you doing here?" Ethan smiled, a rare, honest, almost shy smile. "I came for another cup of coffee. This time, at your place." Maria froze, then laughed, warm and genuine. She opened the door and invited him in. The house was small and worn, but it radiated comfort. The wallpaper had faded flowers, a ceramic vase held a few wild daisies on the table, and the air carried the gentle aroma of chicken soup. 2 little girls ran out, hair tied in twin ponytails, eyes bright with curiosity. "Mama, who is he?" Maria smiled softly. "He's a friend of Mama's. Ethan knelt, smiling, and opened the paper bag. Inside were 2 new pink backpacks. The girls squealed with delight, throwing their arms around his neck. It was only a brief hug, but it was the warmest embrace Ethan had felt in years. After a simple lunch, chicken soup, cornbread, and coffee, Ethan pulled the folder from his bag and slid it across the table toward her. "I've been thinking about this," he said quietly. "I'd like you to become operations manager at the Caldwell estate. You'll oversee the entire household staff. Full-time, triple pay, insurance, and flexible hours so you can care for your mother and daughters." Maria froze, eyes glistening. "Mr. Caldwell, you don't have to do this." Ethan shook his head. His face, the smile of a man who had been forgiven and had learned to forgive himself. The SUV rolled down the sunlit street. Ethan lowered the window, letting the warm breeze rush through his hair. He thought of his father's old words. And this time, he didn't hear them with his mind, but with his heart. Wealth isn't what's inside a safe. It's the ability to trust someone without fear of betrayal. Ethan smiled faintly, gazing up at the vast Texas sky. And in that golden afternoon light, he knew the test he had once set for someone else had become the lesson that redeemed him. Sometimes, the most essential tests in life don't happen in boardrooms or battlefields, but in quiet moments when no one is watching. Maria didn't choose money. She chose integrity. Ethan didn't choose power. He chose faith. And because of that, both of them found freedom. Sometimes, the richest people are those who can sleep with a clear heart, not those who own the biggest safes. If this story touched you, leave a heart in the comments. Share it with someone who's lost faith. And remember, do what's right, even when no one's watching. This is Deep Life Tales, where small stories reveal the quiet power of kindness.